Okay, Zaina.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for another webinar organized by the Malta Business Bureau discussing the latest EU policies and legislations. I know it's been obviously a busy morning considering it's after a long weekend, so thank you for making the time to join us today. During the next hour or an hour and a half, we will be discussing the latest European Commission strategy for a simpler and faster Europe. It's a new dimension, a new political wind at the start of this legislature, focused more on competitiveness. And would like to share with you in a little bit in more detail what this is about and talk about more specifically about the first initiative, which essentially looks at simplifying regulation. Today we will have an introduction by the CEO of the Malta Business Bureau, Mario Schwirep, and then I will make the presentations of the topic of the day. After that, we'll have some guest speakers, which I will introduce in due course during this event. So with that, I would like to immediately give the floor to Mario Schwirep to make the introductory remarks.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar. We enjoyed a long weekend here in Malta, but now it's back to business. And as Malta Business Bureau, we have organized this webinar because we want to share as much information as possible about two initiatives launched by the European Commission a few weeks ago. And we also want to understand what business and industry think about these two initiatives. I am referring in particular to the recent European Commission strategy for a simpler and faster Europe, as well as the Omnibus packages on sustainability and investment. But first thing first, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Malta Business Bureau, well, basically, we represent the Malta Chamber of Commerce, Enterprise and Industry, and the Malta Hotels and Restaurants Association, both in Brussels and in Malta. And we represent them on EU matters, of course. As MBB, one of our roles is to inform the Maltese business community about EU policy and legislative developments, whilst also, of course, gathering opinions directly from local businesses to convey to our representatives at EU level. And that includes government at council level, members of the European Parliament, the European Economic and Social Committee, and also our wider network of business organizations. Now, let's focus on today's topic. The last single market annual report showed that regulatory burden is seen as an obstacle by 2/3 of European companies. And another interesting observation is that while services account for 70% of EU GDP, trade and cross-border services with the EU represents less than 1/3 of that in goods. Now, this is largely attributed to regulatory fragmentation. Regulatory burden and regulatory fragmentation create barriers. They create obstacles for companies, especially for those companies who have set the objective of scaling up, both at national level and also those who intend to venture cross-border in the single market. This presents a missed opportunity for investment and growth, which partly explains the growing disparity between the EU and its global competitors. This fact alone has been highlighted last year, and rightly so, by two former Italian prime ministers, Enrico Letta in his More Than a Market report, and Mario Draghi in his report on future European competitiveness. Both reports were published last year. Now, the European Commission has acknowledged that this issue needs addressing, and it must be done fast. As part of the political guidelines, President von der Leyen committed herself and the Commission to a reduction in the administrative burdens by 25% for companies and a 35% reduction for SMEs. We will learn more about this in a presentation that Daniel will be delivering shortly. As Malta Business Bureau, we generally believe that the Commission's intentions, as declared at the start of this legislature period mandate, are a step in the right direction. But MBB would also like that words are translated into action sooner rather than later. Some initiatives have already been announced as part of the work program for 2025 and will be rolled out later this year, including the introduction of a new category for small mid-caps, a package looking at simplifying digital legislation specifically in the areas of cybersecurity and data, the EU Startup and Scale-up strategy. Well, that's just to mention a few. There's a host of others. But the first concrete step was taken with the issuing of the Omnibus packages for sustainability and investment that we will also be presenting and discussing today. This webinar comes at the right time because this week, during the current plenary in Strasbourg, MEPs will be voting on the Stop the Clock proposal, which is meant to postpone, delay the implementation of the CSRD and CSDDD. As MBB, we have called upon all MEPs, all the Maltese MEPs, to stop the clock and to provide legal certainty for businesses. On that note, I hope that you will find the session informative, and I do encourage you to share your thoughts and views with us, as this will feed into the MBB's advocacy work at EU level as we convey the sentiment and the thoughts of the Maltese businesses to stakeholders in Brussels. Thank you, Daniel, and it's over to you again.
You're muted, Daniel.
Right. Apologies for that. Thank you, Mario, for the introductory remarks. I was just about to share the presentation that I will be delivering, as Mario Shurap mentioned, to present in more detail the strategy by the European Commission for a simpler and faster Europe, as well as describe in more detail the first attempt at simplifying legislation with the Omnibus package for sustainability files and investment. I would like to also say throughout this presentation, feel free to already start sharing your comments and questions in the Q&A section. There will be a time during this event where we will also give the opportunity to you to share your views even live. You'll just need to raise your hand and my colleague Michele will give you the floor. So let me start with the presentation on the simpler and faster strategy. I will not go into much detail about the context because this was provided in the introductory remarks already, but in a nutshell, Europe is overregulated. We knew this for a long time, but the Letta and Draghi reports have essentially given an impetus, a new momentum for the European Commission to do something about it. It's now acknowledged. In fact, the Draghi reports includes a statistic which is alarming, I would say, that in the last 5 years, or at least in the last mandate by the European Commission, the EU enacted over or around, let's say, 13,000 legislative acts, whilst in the US they enacted 3,500. So that's more than threefold number of regulations that European companies had to adhere to and implement compared to their US counterparts. And therefore, this accumulation of rules, not only in the last mandates, but over time, 30 years since the establishment of the single market, certainly build up a huge amount of burden on companies, and it results in a lack of competitiveness for them compared to counterparts on the global level. So this strategy has three main pillars, I would say, if we had to simplify it. The first is on how the European Commission intends to work more closely with member states to ensure proper implementation, because one of the biggest hurdles that we come across is not only the burdens provided by the EU regulations as such, but then the way they are implemented. Many times member states add more burdens, something which we call gold plating, and that makes it obviously more difficult for companies to operate. The second pillar is the reduction of administrative burden, and although a separate initiative but somewhat related, to design a simpler EU budget for the next 7 years. And thirdly, on how we improve EU rulemaking in the first place. So let's start with the first section on how the European Commission intends to help member states implement legislation in a better way. First and foremost, when a European legislation, whether it would be a directive or a regulation, is adopted, the Commission will be ready with an implementation roadmap on how to assist member states on a technical level to ensure, as I mentioned, as much as possible to avoid gold plating. One measure would be to using existing instruments. You may perhaps not be familiar, but the Commission has this instrument called the Single Market Enforcement Task Force, whereby it comes together with member states. They identify issues where there are barriers in the single market and try to address them. In this case, using the same instrument to rather react to barriers that have been put in place to anticipate not having them in the first place. The second element is to invest in the administrative capacity and the digital tools and data, both at member state level, but also from the European Commission. There are instruments such as the internal market instrument, where member states are sharing information on the implementation of legislation, and this could also be a way of anticipating problems and address them before they become a problem. Engaging more effectively with stakeholders. So the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has required all of the commissioners to organize at least 2 stakeholder forums annually in order to directly meet with the people, with the businesses, with entities related to the topics related to their portfolio, to ensure that there are ears and eyes on the ground, and ensuring that policymaking is done also thanks to consultation with the people involved. And finally, swift and resolute enforcement action. This means that obviously when member states are not implementing as they should be, the Commission will continue pressing through legal instruments such as infringement procedures, and whereby member states don't comply, obviously it will be taken to the European Court of Justice, and the Commission will continue doing so in order to ensure smoother implementation of legislation. The second pillar, as I mentioned, is about reducing the administrative burden and simplification of legislation. So Mario in the introduction mentioned the new target of 25% reduction for companies in general and 35% reduction of administrative burden for SMEs. Now, this is not new. It has been around as a target for a couple of months. I believe the Commission President had initially mentioned it in the State of the Union speech some 2 years ago, but there was always a question on how it will be implemented. And now, basically, the Commission has done an economic exercise whereby it qualified the amount of administrative burden based on current legislation to the amount of 150 billion euro, and therefore in the process, as we will be discussing, of reviewing and evaluating the current legislations in more detail, they will need to find ways where they could reduce the burden in money terms by 25%, which would be to around 37 billion euro. And this is a gradual process, of course, as was also mentioned in the introduction. In the work program of this year already, there are a number of initiatives which have been identified. I will not repeat all of them, but one of them we will be discussing today, the Omnibus package on sustainability and investment. But the Commission is committing itself to review the entire EU acquis, the whole book of laws of the European Union, one by one, to see where it is possible to reduce administrative burden through digitalization, to removing provisions that are no longer relevant because it would be a very old legislation, for instance. So it's a way of modernizing, let's say, EU laws in their entirety. And finally, on a slightly separate topic, to have a more streamlined and simplified European budget. The multi-annual financial framework, which for those of you who are not familiar with, the EU works with EU budgets in 7-year frameworks, right? So currently we are in the budget which will run until 2027. The new budget will run from 2028 to 2034. And in fact, this year in June, the Commission is already expected to publish its proposal on how the new EU budget will be designed. And currently there are over 50 EU programs working simultaneously in parallel, overlapping each other at times. So what the Commission intends to do is to streamline as much as possible these programs under different pillars in order to create flexibility to shift funds from one program to the other according to the necessities, because we know that 7 years is a very long period, and there will certainly be a need to have the necessary flexibility to adjust and move around the funds according to the priorities at the time. And the last pillar under this strategy is on how to improve rulemaking in the EU by essentially reinforce the SME and competitiveness check. This has been a commitment that the Commission President made ahead of the start of this new legislature. There are different elements that are studied when the European Commission is making an impact assessment prior to publishing a legislation, and it will look at different elements such as, for example, the cost element introduced with a new legislation, the impact on international competitiveness of companies, the impact on the competitiveness of SMEs, and whether there's also an impact on innovation, on limiting innovation within those legislations. Then there will also be the scrutiny of delegated and implementing acts. I do not want to go into too much technical elements, but essentially what is adopted at European level through the co-legislative procedure, through the EU Council and the European Parliament, is the framework of a legislation, right? But then there would be certain elements linked to that legislation, which would be rather procedural, and rather than the law itself would go into these prescriptive elements, that would be outsourced, so to speak, to the European Commission and a committee of experts to come up with those procedures. But these procedures are not in practice impact assessed, and they could themselves create an administrative burden to companies. So there's this commitment to start also introducing some form of assessment of these delegated and implementing acts. Then there is the element of smart and digital delivery integrated in the design of EU laws. What this means is to have, let's say, embedding digital by default and the once only principle to avoid repeated administrative processes for companies. And finally, a simple methodology to assess the impact of significant amendments. This is another important issue that we have talked about many times in the past, whereby essentially what you have the European Commission prior to issuing a proposal, it does an impact assessment, but then that proposal starts changing bit by bit when it goes to the co-legislators. When it goes to the EU Council and it goes to the European Parliament, they would be introducing changes to that original proposal that was impact assessed. However, when they are making changes, they are not assessing the changes that they're making, which they could themselves then be creating a new administrative burden. And we have experience of this even as a country. If we look back at the mobility package and the issues we had, you might recall, because it was very famous in the media, this return of the truck provision in that mobility package that came about as a result of an intervention in the legislative process rather than a proposal by the Commission itself. It was not impact assessed, and then we ended up with the result that we have. This is just one example of many that happens throughout this process. So what the Commission will be doing here is to create a simple methodology which would allow the Parliament or the Council to adopt some form of assessment on significant changes that they introduce, because obviously the idea is not to stall the process. It's already complex to come up to an agreement and to adopt EU laws. It's a complex process in itself, but there needs to be this element of studying the changes that are happening during the course of adopting a new legislation. So moving forward, the Commission is committing to issuing, or every Commissioner will be committed to issue an annual report on the progress that they have achieved in line with this strategy in order to ensure transparency and accountability. So this is in a nutshell what the strategy for a simpler and faster Europe is about. I know it's a little bit, theoretic, governance, high level, but it sends the right signal that at least from an institutional perspective, they acknowledge that there is a problem and they're going to do something about it. So perhaps a little bit more tangible, it would be good to discuss the first two initiatives that the Commission has undertaken to simplify the regulatory burden on companies. These are relatively new legislations that were adopted last year, and it was immediately realized that essentially, I wouldn't say they're not fit for purpose, but perhaps they went beyond what is necessary and created a substantial burden on companies. So a proposed amendment to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the EU Taxonomy, and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I will explain, for the benefit of those that are not familiar with these legislation, a little bit what they are and also what the changes proposed will be. So let's start perhaps with the most famous one, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This essentially is a directive that will require companies of a certain size to undertake sustainability reporting as part of their ESG requirements. They will not only report on their financial statements, but also on their sustainability or the ESG activities. Okay, in the current directive, the one that started to be implemented as of last year, it applied to companies employing more than 250 people and also to listed SMEs. It was being implemented in a gradual pace. So last year it started with the larger companies employing more than 500 people. As of this year, or as of this financial year, it would have started to apply for companies employing 250 people, and next financial year to listed SMEs. Now, with the new proposal that has been put on the table, essentially the Commission, first of all, it proposed to stop the clock for the implementation of the current directive. So it's a 2-year postponement for those companies that are not yet reporting. Okay, the ones that started reporting last year, the companies employing more than 500 people, will continue reporting, but the ones that were supposed to enter into the system or into the framework this year will have this postponement for 2 years until the new proposal is discussed at European level. But the way it's been proposed for the new proposal that will come in once it's agreed or adopted at EU level, the threshold will move up to 1,000 employees as a first criteria, and there will also need to be a second criteria, which would be one of two, either or a 50 million turnover or a 25 million euro balance sheet. Okay, so this is the major change in terms of scope for companies to be subject to the directive, but the current directive also required, obviously, the development of the standards, a process that took place over the past year or two. And this also is deemed to be, let's say, an excessive process because it resulted in reporting requirements of around 1,200 data points, which is obviously quite a lot. And therefore, even for those companies that will continue reporting, the number of data points will be revised and redimensioned. So this is one element. In parallel, there is also a process whereby voluntary standards are being developed in a much more simpler format for those companies that might not fall in scope, but still feel a need for their own corporate social responsibility policies within their own companies or within their own group to report and yet use a standard which is acknowledged across the European Union. So this is a little bit in more detail the simplification, which I think you could see because it's extremely visible for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I'll move to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The name is fairly similar, but they are a little bit different from each other. So whilst the first one was purely about the reporting, okay, the second one, it's more about the companies falling in scope having internal policies that know what their supply chain is doing and prevent, or where they have information to mitigate any environmental degradation or human rights abuses that take place not just within their company, but within their direct business partners and any other business that falls within their supply chain. The actual word used or actual term used in the directive is chain of activities because it's a slightly narrow definition than what supply chain means, but for simplicity, we'll keep using supply chain. So with the change of the new proposal, let's say, first of all, it's important to say that the companies falling in scope directly are rather large multinational companies, okay? They are companies that employ 1,000 people and have a global revenue of 450 million euro. However, this does not mean that it will not impact many other companies that may be mid-caps or SMEs. Because as I mentioned, the companies that fall in scope need to have an eye and have responsibility to what goes on even within those companies that they make business with. And not simply the ones they make business directly, but even 10, 15 companies down the line throughout the supply chain. And that is where Maltese companies will more likely fit in as part of that broader global supply chains. Now, with the change in this directive, essentially what is being proposed is that the companies falling in scope, these large multinational companies, will only be responsible no longer for the whole supply chain, but only for the direct business partners that they are doing business with. Unless, and there is this a little bit of a caveat, unless they have plausible information that there's something wrong at some point throughout their supply chain in which they would need to investigate and take action. But from a Maltese business perspective, therefore, they would only fall in scope indirectly of this directive if they're doing business directly with the large multinational falling in scope of the directive. And even if they do, should they be a company that they employ less than 500 people, there's a limit to the information that this large multinational company would be able to ask from them. So the information that could be asked from them would be limited to the voluntary standards that, as I just mentioned, are applicable to the other legislation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So whilst previously they could come in and ask you for anything, for any justification, which would be an administrative and reporting burden in itself, now there is a limitation as to what these companies could ask you if you fall within their supply chain as a direct business partner. There is one other element which is interesting, another proposed change to this directive. In the current one, essentially the financial services were excluded, but to a certain extent. It was excluded from the current directive, but there was a provision requiring the Commission to come up with a separate legislative proposal specifically for the financial services. And this would have meant that obviously for companies to go and ask for financing, it would be the financial institution would have an obligation to ensure that those companies are meeting the requirements of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So obviously, it would have created not only administrative burden on the financial institutions, but it would potentially make the cost of financing higher. Now, with the new proposal, this requirement is being removed. So the Commission is no longer now required to come up with a separate proposal for the financial institutions. A few words on the EU taxonomy and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the other two proposals falling under this Omnibus package. Essentially, the threshold of the EU taxonomy is being raised from 250 employees to 1,000 employees with 450 million euro turnover. So this is to align it with the companies that fall in scope of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The EU taxonomy is somewhat similar to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, but not exactly the same, because the EU taxonomy is essentially classifying the economic activities according to environmental sustainability, whilst as we were talking about the CSRD, it's reporting on the broader ESG. Okay. Few words on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is extremely sectoral, so it might not be of interest to everyone. However, currently, what the EU has done was to introduce this carbon tax on certain products being imported from third countries, most notably products such as cement, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, and a few others. And the reason is that we already apply the carbon tax in the EU on EU producers through the emission trading system, and therefore they were at an unlevel playing field because European manufacturers were paying a carbon tax, but when the same product was imported from outside of the EU, they were produced by manufacturers that were not paying a carbon tax. And therefore, by applying a carbon tax equivalent to the EU carbon tax on entry, this created a level playing field. However, it was creating an administrative burden on small importers, and the Omnibus essentially exempting the small importers up to a certain amount, 50 tons, importing 50 tons per year of the relevant products, to exempt them from having to comply with CBAM. And statistically, this will exclude 90% of importers, yet it will still capture 99% of emissions. And therefore, sometimes it's good to be smarter rather than throw a blanket requirement on let's say, stakeholders. So this is about the Omnibus package. I'm sorry, I'm providing a lot of detail. I hope it's not too much, but I'll go to the last point before then we talk and open up the discussion with our guest speakers and also with our audience. The second Omnibus package on investment. This, I would say, for businesses, they will not see the impact directly. So the ones that benefiting directly are the financial intermediaries that are the ones going to the EU institutions to make use of financial instruments such as bank guarantees and special conditions that are provided through the European Investment Fund. Essentially, you have the national development banks and the private commercial banks that are making use of these guarantees by the European institutions, so that then they would create products that would reduce, let's say, the requirements on the direct business beneficiaries, right? So the direct business beneficiaries here will benefit as in an indirect way. Essentially, what the revision of the InvestEU regulation will require less reporting, less frequent reporting from the financial institutions, and this will, as I mentioned, in a way facilitate the products that they eventually make available for direct business beneficiaries. So I will stop here because I think I talked a lot. Apologies for taking too long. I will stop here with the presentation. I'm not sure if there are any comments or questions already specifically on the presentation. Feel free to use the Q&A or to raise your hand. But to perhaps make it a little bit more interesting rather than the theoretical presentation, we have invited some guest speakers that are, I would say, perhaps direct beneficiaries of this Omnibus package. And here I would like to immediately introduce and thank for accepting our invitation Nick Schwirep, who's the Chief Financial Officer of Tolly Products and up until recently Deputy President of the Malta Chamber, and also Jonathan Patch, who is the Area General Manager of the Corinthia Group, recently appointed Director of the Malta Business Bureau, and is also representing the Malta Hotels and Restaurants Association. So let's start perhaps with Nick. Nick, Tolly Products is a company that was subject to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in its current format. Most probably it might be exempted if it stays as is, unless there's changes, because there could possibly be changes to the proposal. We just wanted to hear from you how you're looking at this, let's say, new EU dimension focused on competitiveness, and whether something like this Omnibus package actually makes a difference to a company like yours with an international dimension.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Mario, as well, for your introduction. I think it's good to hear that the EU is reducing administrative burdens for companies. I can tell you, we see it. I mean, from AML over recent years, lots of new regulators popping up everywhere. And being an international group, it has become, I would say, very demanding and requiring more resource. And when we look at our US subsidiary, we do have a wholly owned subsidiary in the US. The regulatory burdens there are a fraction of what we see in Malta. I can say the same thing about Asia, where we have quite a large subsidiary there in Hong Kong. I mean, just by way of background on Tolly, maybe many people know, but maybe not everybody. So Tolly is a company which is in the beauty and cosmetics industry, and we supply either packaging, but also more than packaging today, even full service products and even design and other services to top brands across the globe. We manufacture and trade in 3 continents, Americas, Europe, and Asia, and we have sales presence in most markets, but our key markets in reality is US and France, which covers about 70% of our revenues. Just a bit of background as well, we are about 400 to 450 direct employees, but we probably have another 400 to 500 through our joint ventures, where we have less than just below 50% ownership. We're a 70 million business with 100 million balance sheet. So under the previous rules, we definitely fell under CSRD wave 2. So obviously being in the plastics industry and working with large brands such as L'Oreal, Louis Vuitton's, who owns several brands like Christian Dior and many others, sustainability has been very high on the agenda, especially these very large French companies who are very obviously aware of the impact this has on their reputation. So we've been probably working on sustainability, I would think about 7-8 years. So this has been on our agenda for quite some time. We've been looking at alternative materials. So obviously for us, that is critical, from things like recycled materials and materials that can be recycled. And we've seen laws that have been issued in the EU to that effect, to using different materials. For example, if a material called from a company paper foam, it's made from potato starch, so it's 100% recyclable. Reporting, we've been reporting voluntarily under the NFRD. So although we were not obliged for the last 6-7 years, we've been reporting there. Today we have a chief officer responsible for sustainability with a team of 2. So we've really invested in this. We have had our Scopes 1 and Scopes 2 on the emissions audited in 2022 and 2023, and we'll do the same thing for 2024. Our ambition is to also get Scope 3 audited. So the bottom line, we've invested heavily in sustainability and in CSRD. We have 1.5 employees who are really dedicated to CSRD, and we probably spent around 50,000 in consulting just on CSRD. I would say the biggest headache has been the double materiality assessment, which I've been involved at a very high level. And I have to admit, I at times really struggle to understand the complexity required to arrive at whether something is material, because double materiality means it's material from an ESG perspective, environmental, social, or governance side, and also whether it's material from a financial. And if you hit one of the 2, therefore, any data points in the CSRD directives needs to be reported on. And you need to look not only at yourself, but also all the way down to the supply chain. This is how the current CSRD is. So the level of detail and complexity is very high. From what I see, it requires both financial and engineering skills. So you need people on the financial side, you need people on the engineering. You can't have one or the other. So you try and manage it from the financial side, you're going to have a mess, because accountants are not going to understand a lot of the technical detail. On the engineering, people only, they're not going to understand the financial side. So besides, the complexity increases exponentially once you get into the whole value chain. For example, plastic, you need to go all the way back to from where the oil is produced. But that needs to be done for every single item that you use, whether it's mirrors, pins, in our case, different decorations, lacquers, and so on. So one can see that even consultants are learning with us all the time, as the rush to implement has meant that there's been a lot of learning along the way. So I'd say in truth, companies who have been eligible have had to pay a lot already for this. So I'm really happy to see that at last someone in the European Union has seen the light. Last week, I was really happy when we met, when I was still part of the chamber board of management as deputy president. We met Frederick Persson from Business Europe. And you could see the critical role that Business Europe played to put a bit of sense into the European Commission to understand the implications this is having on business. So although our company will now fall out of scope if this Omnibus Act goes through, because the first step, as you said, is stop the clock. So the 2-year suspension, and then reducing firstly the numbers required to be eligible, and under the current proposal we will fall outside. And also secondly, as we understand, there will be reduced for everybody, they will reduce the level of reporting requirements. So I think all in all, I think this is a positive move for us. We will definitely continue reporting because we believe that it is a good thing, especially in our industry. But it gives us a breathing space, as we were really finding it hard, although our auditors told us we were in line with all the companies which were listed, which were reporting 1 year ahead of us. So we're actually in line with them. But we felt it was really tough to get to the final line, which would have been reporting 2025 and 2026. So this is going to give us breathing space to readjust and move forward. So I think this is very positive, and I hope to see more and more of this coming out of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. And I want to take one point that you mentioned. Thank you for referring to Mr. Pearson's visit to Malta. I think it was very useful to have the President of Business Europe understanding Maltese business on the ground, because many times, even in my role representing the Chamber in Business Europe in Brussels, it's very difficult to explain to people who have not visited Malta the specific realities that we have, and therefore it was a very important visit in this respect. And also the work that we have done through Business Europe, but as Malta Business Bureau as well, we have pushed with the Maltese government, with the Maltese MPs, to ensure that this omnibus goes through. We're still not yet there. The Parliament, perhaps MEP Peter Rajus will soon explain, will be voting this week on this, but I will not spoil that. I will leave it for him to elaborate on. But before we go to MEP Peter Rajus, I'd like to invite Jonathan Patch to share with us from a different sector. I would say we had from Nick from the manufacturing side. Now we could hear from the hospitality business side, but even though Corinthia has other business interests as well. Jonathan, your perspective on this new wave, this new competitiveness dimension at EU level, and the attempts to simplify legislation for business. How do you see it from your end?
Hi, Daniel. Thank you again. On the call, coincidentally, we also have Patrick Spiteri-Staines, and as Nick said, Corinthia has also had to invest, to align to this reporting. And Patrick is actually the person has been specifically hired by the Corinthia Group to manage this. Talking a bit about the MHRA and how this the bureaucracy in general in reporting costs money and time. So we are all, the positive part is that we are all into sustainability, and whether you are obliged to report or not, nowadays has become almost an obligation, a human obligation, to give something back, or at least to stop damaging the world that we live in. As Corinthia and most of the hotels and restaurants nowadays, they have understood this. We are also being pushed by many of our clients. Today, more than ever, clients are looking for responsible tourism. Interestingly, even the younger generation is looking into more local experiences, less carbon footprint experiences. So all in all, we are, whether we have an obligation to report or not, we are obliged to move in that way. Where it becomes a bit challenging is the obligation of reporting or the due diligence, because if you would have to be responsible for someone else, and in markets like Malta, where access to products is limited, then that means that you would have to invest more time, energy to get to products or services that are compliant with this. And again, the end result is all, it costs more money, it takes more time, and in certain cases, certain products might not be available in your market or in the quantities that you would want to purchase it. So more or less, we're all in, talking about the MHRA, we're all in such initiatives. where they reduce bureaucracy and reporting. We do things not just for reporting, but just to create a better world. We know that this is not going away. So nowadays, when you go to financing, it's one of the top criteria. So it has not become only a matter of you are obliged to do it, but you go for financing. And this is most of the time with certain banks, this is the #1 priority. So if you do not manage to be aligned, then financing might not be available, or it might cost you more. So yeah, it's all positive. Any initiative that reduces bureaucracy and helps us, be more efficient in conducting business is obviously very helpful for us.
Thank you, Jonathan. In fact, I'm happy you made also reference to the due diligence, because that was one of our main points when we were discussing this prior to the Omnibus, that it's one does not doubt the good intentions that companies take responsibility that throughout their supply chain there's no human rights abuses or environmental degradation. But many times the problem is, how do you get the information from these companies which are far away, and how do you verify that information? That was the biggest issue. So some of these are being addressed, in fact, with the Omnibus. I would like to now pass on the words to MEP Peter Ajus. I know that at 1 o'clock you have to be in the IMCO committee, so thank you for sticking with us until the last moment. Peter, I'll put you a little bit of a devil advocate's question, right? You're a politician. Politicians all the time, or we hear from politicians all the time, that we need to reduce bureaucracy and the administrative burden, yet it's the politicians who, through the legislative process, are placing these obligations many times on companies. How do you see this, given your long experience in the EU institutions, but more recently as a legislator yourself?
Hi, everyone. Big thanks. I've been following attentively. Yes, indeed, in 10 minutes, I need to be at the IMCO preparatory meeting with a number of points on the agenda, which will also interest you. So I'll try to use these, let's say 7 minutes. Is that okay? First of all, to give a bit of a macro picture, how I see things, as you asked. And then also some last minute information about the Omnibus itself, including the vote we'll be having at noon, because we're voting at noon to authorize the urgency procedure for the Omnibus today. The macro picture, I am sorry to say that sometimes when I look at the European Union and the way it legislates, especially in the last few years, it has become an auditor's paradise. So we have taken up the tendency of including auditing obligations, reporting obligations for everything we do. I think part of it is the political consequence of having a number of member states who have a particular perspective on regulation itself. They see regulation as the solution to everything. The departure of the UK from the negotiating table, this does not help this, because the UK was always a partner in the deregulation, in the reduction of administrative burdens debate. So with the Brexit, the narrative of those member states who always saw rules as the solution got stronger. So in the last years, we saw an exponential increase in reporting obligations and regulatory burdens, also attached to the Green Deal. Now, what we see right now, also characterized by a stronger center-right movement in the European Parliament, a stronger component of EPP in the European Commission, a stronger also participation in the European Parliament of right movements. So I'm sensing there is a strong difference from the past legislatures. So the balance has shifted a bit to the center right. I can see this in committees. I have participated yesterday in a vote, for instance, in the Development Committee. I participate regularly in votes also in committees in the Internal Market and in other committees. And I can see now that, there is a determination to see this reduction of administrative burdens, to see a more sensible approach to regulation. I think the election of Trump is a wake-up call. So right now we see all the nationalism expressed by President Trump. Of course, it scares us to some extent, that we are losing touch with multilateralism, but at the same time, it communicates a message that politicians are meant to act first and foremost to protect national markets, to protect their industry, their manufacturing, their service base. So in a way, in an ironic way, this can have its beneficial impacts to the way we think and the way we formulate policy in the European Union. I think that we are also seeing a tendency over the past years. To me, it's a misinterpretation of globalization. So it's true, I, as a European, also as an EPP MEP, I want Europe to be a leader in the fight against climate change. There's no doubt about that. But we must also have keep a close eye into how the rules that we adopt are affecting our competitiveness abroad. So I think we must draw a clear distinction between the rules which are exclusively for internal market and our own dealings inside the member state, which can deal with marketing authorizations, labeling, CE marking, anything you have. But then we need to keep an eye then on how this affects us when we need to sell our product, when we need to market our product elsewhere. And as you were saying also earlier, as evident also in all the punch of Business Europe, for instance, our companies are internationalized. So we cannot just think on how our consumers need to use a product, but we need to think about our markets globally. So I think this has been not enough carefully analyzed in the past. And now, therefore, we need to basically turn a bit the direction of our ship and focus on this reduction of administrative burdens, 25% on companies, 35% on SMEs. And I can tell you, inside the EPP, maybe together with the defense, this is the biggest thing on our mind. Maybe bigger than defense, actually, because defense also has a competitiveness aspect. Defense also has an industrialization aspect. Defense also has an R&D, a strong R&D aspect. And sometimes I think also that a lot of MEPs, unlike me, because for me, being Maltese, I am bound by neutrality, so I am not particularly active in the defense field. But I think that a lot of MEPs who are very active, they do it also in this context, in the context of industrialization, competitiveness, rekindling the manufacturing base in Europe, But as reverting to my point, together with defense, this reduction of administrative burdens, this emphasis on competitiveness is the biggest thing on our mind as EPP. I can tell you that. And I can see it in every working group, in every committee, in every group meeting, in every plenary. And so I am very satisfied to see this. And I can, Wichimel Formidable Malti, I can offer my partnership to you as MBB, to the business community in Malta, together we need to push now, we need to push with the concrete steps forward. And Daniel, you will know, Mario, you will know, all of my colleagues will know that, I am there to help when you reach out. Sometimes I actually reach out to you and I need your help as well to understand what's happening, to understand where we need to act, because we need to act selectively in a very intelligent way, creating alliances all the way, okay? But I am there to help, and I will be there for reduction of administrative burdens, for simplification. So please get in touch, and we'll push this forward together. That's it from my end. I'm sorry I have to leave because I have to run for a committee meeting in 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, MEP Dr. Peter Rajus. So I will not keep you with any follow-up questions, but I think you were very clear in your intervention. Thanks for the time and for being with us today and for all your support, because I can attest to that whenever we needed to reach out to you, you're always very welcoming. Thanks for that. I will also have to let go some of our other guest speakers. I promised them that the event would be of 1 hour, even though we marketed it as a 1.5 hour, but I wanted to allow some extra time for questions if there are. And in fact, we received one question from Timothy Olden, a former colleague. Thanks also, Timothy, for joining us today. It was a very pertinent question on whether businesses perceive that there is any practical value to the costly exercises like the double materiality assessment. And it's an interesting question, which obviously merits, I think, a much more in-depth answer than the one that I will give. But from my experience working with businesses and also from hearing our guest speakers today, I think that companies, and particularly those of a certain size that might not be large but might be mid-caps, okay, feel the need to undertake certain reporting, including the double materiality assessment. It's part of their broader, let's say, CSR policy. It's part of what their clients expect. It's part from what the financial institutions are requiring. But I think what's important to focus on is the extensiveness of the requirements rather than having some requirements in this field. So when we talked about the CSRD, which developed more than 1,200 data points, was this really necessary? I mean, I will not go into the detail of these data points because I'm not technical enough to do so, but probably, I mean, just hearing the number on a data point that you'd have to report on annually, one immediately comes to the conclusion without even, having to go through all the data points themselves. So I think it's all about proportionality, and this is where we hope that the new direction of the European Commission and ultimately all the institutions will take up as we move forward. I hope I answered that question. I invite others who would like to share any comments or questions in the Q&A section. I see that someone might have written something in the chat, which I'm trying to open. There's a comment by Yolande Svensson. Hello, Yolande. I resonate with the fact that such administrative burdens will decrease our competitiveness and effectiveness in implementing sustainable practices. Should we invest our restricted budget in consulting and auditing services to align with CSRD, or should we focus on waste reduction and renewable energy solutions to make a real difference to the world around us? I think it's a rhetoric question, which I think obviously gives the answer, which we all agree to, that obviously we should avoid creating unnecessary cost and rather invest low cost on aspects that we would really have an impact on. Thanks for that. Any other questions or comments? Please feel free to share. I'll give maybe just a few moments. Well, it seems that those are the comments that we are receiving today. And with that, therefore, I will conclude today's event. I would like to first and foremost, there seems to be another. Let me just switch to the Q&A. Okay, Carl Zamit La Rose, I understand that the vote on the stop the clock will be held imminently. Do we know when the second vote on the content proposal will be held? Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the procedure. So the vote that is taking place today is in the European Parliament is essentially to decide whether the European Parliament will adopt the fast track procedure. Right? The Parliament has many rules. There are certain exceptions in which the Parliament could take up a fast-track procedure to avoid having to go to the committee and instead go directly to the plenary where they are today, or this week rather, and take a vote on that. But to be able to do so, they have to first vote on the procedure. That's the vote that is taking place today. Once that takes place, and most likely, I mean, I don't know the outcome, but let's say it will be accepted, there will be a time window of 24 hours for any MEP to table any amendments to the stop the clock proposal, okay? And then on Thursday, it is programmed that the plenary will vote on any amendments tabled. whether to accept or reject, and ultimately on the stop the clock proposal itself. Now, if it is adopted with no changes, it would mean that it would be in line with what the EU Council has already adopted last week, because the Council, the national governments collectively adopted the stop the clock proposal with no changes. So if there's no changes in the European Parliament, that means that there could be a quick resolution and the, let's say, postponement of the current directives will come into effect. Then for the most substantial part, the second proposal, which is revising or simplifying the amending the current directives, that is a process that will take its course through the normal co-decision procedure. So you will have the EU Council discussing on its part, the European Parliament discussing on its part. Eventually, they will have their own positions and they will come together in trilogues and come up with the final text. That's a process that on average in EU, let's say, timelines take between a year or 2 years. In this case, there is much more scrutiny, there's much more expectations to move fast, but in the EU, obviously, nothing is that simple. There are different interests involved, and therefore one would need to look at how that discussion evolves. However, the first step is the stop the clock, postponing the current directives by 2 years for CSRD and with 1 year for the CSDDD. And then there will be ample time to discuss the new proposals. Indications are that, let's say, if there's a real commitment, hopefully there would be an adoption at least in the Council and Parliament at some point this year. And whether this will be, completely agreed to then between the two institutions together with the Commission this year also, it's a question to be seen. It depends on how fast it goes, but it's all speculation at this stage, and I cannot comment further on that. I hope that I explained a little bit the procedure in more detail for our audience also to understand. Very good. I'm checking on the other side if there are any other questions. Seems not. So with that, I will bring today's event at a close. I take the opportunity to thank all of you once again for joining us this morning. I hope it was informative and interesting for you to follow this session. I would like to thank Mario Schwirep, who gave the introductory remarks, Nick Schwirep from Tolly Products, and Jonathan Patch from the Corinthia Group, who also were with us as guest speakers, and MEP Peter Ajus from the European Parliament, who also shared with us his views. And I would like to thank Michele Ajus, who assisted me, and Ralph Grima from the MBB team, who assisted me on the technical parts of this event. Thank you so much, and I invite you to continue following the MBB and follow our events in the future. I wish you all a good day.